Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage New York Times editorial director of live journalism, Adam Bryant.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Adam Bryant, editorial director of live journalism at the New York Times, and we are honored to partner with the University of Chicago Crime Lab to bring you this event, Chicago at a Crossroads, Solving the Gun Violence Problem. It is a reflection of our shared and sustained commitment to exploring the roots of this crisis and also for seeking solutions. And we know that commitment is shared by all of you, including our sponsors who help make this evening possible. Judy and Peter Kovler of the Bloom Kovler Foundation, Chase, Brent and Catherine Gledhill, William Blair, the Irving Harris Foundation, the Polk Brothers Foundation, the Chicago White Sox, and Michael Small, the CEO of GoGo. Please join me in thanking them for their support. A quick housekeeping note, we are going to take questions from you, the audience, via email tonight. And it's a simple address, it's in your program, we'll have it on the screen as well. It's nytchicago@nytimes.com. Again, nytchicago@nytimes.com. We're also going to be taking some questions from all our viewers who are joining us on Facebook Live, and I'd like to welcome them as well. So let's get the program started. I'd love to bring out Mark Lacey, national editor of the New York Times. Good to see you, Mark. So Mark, as the audience was coming in, we were seeing a montage of all our coverage over the last year, 2 years. Tell us a bit about that plan, the commitment from the New York Times. What was the backstory of that decision?
Well, the Times has 14 national bureaus all across the country. One of them is based here in Chicago. It's one of our largest, and the bureau here, it's headed by a third-generation Chicagoan, Monica Davey. The idea really originated with her. She was writing story after story about this violence. We in New York decided we should do something really special to draw attention to it and to really make our readers who are in Chicago, who are all over the country, all over the world, really feel what's going on in this city.
And one of the biggest stories in this series was a project that you did almost a year ago, weekend, Chicago Memorial Day weekend. There was a lot of people involved in that. Tell us a bit about just the team that you put together.
Right, so it was about 30 journalists who were involved in this story, and that's a whole lot for one story. We came to Chicago, we operated out of the office just a few blocks from here, and we basically worked 24 hours a day for over Memorial Day in shifts from morning to night, all night long. I pulled some overnight shifts myself. And basically what we wanted to do, our goal was to document, to go to every single shooting that happened in Chicago over this time, and we did. And we were there as the police arrived. We were using police scanners to react in real time. And it was a chilling story that we produced.
And what were the surprises for you? I mean, you were part of the reporting team. What struck you about the experience?
I'd been to Chicago a number of my times. My sister lives here, other family members. I see my sister in the audience. And I've visited her many times, and she gets around Chicago, and she's shown me. But I was driving all over the city. Wherever the police scanner sent me, that's where I was going. And so I saw myself the disparities in how people live, and you just see it. It's obvious. So I was driving from wealthy neighborhoods to very rough, very poor neighborhoods, and they're so close. They're miles away from each other, and it's just striking when you see it.
Right. And a big focus of our discussions this evening are around solutions. Through all the coverage, you reporting yourself, editing the stories, what have been some of the insights you've gleaned from that work about what we can do about the crisis?
Right. I mean, we did not want to simply talk about the end result, the numbers, and a lot of journalism is focused just on the tally at the end. But so some of our stories were grappling with what leads to the violence. And obviously it's a very complicated problem, but we were looking at the struggle that young people have to get out of gangs, what it's like to grow up in a neighborhood where there are gangs. And I guess one of the things that I came away with is there's a lot of people living here in Chicago who don't have a lot of hope for a better future. And that's at the core of this. That's one of the things that's at the core of this.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Now I'd like to bring to the stage Jens Ludwig, Director of the UC Crime Lab. Please. Great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that the city of Chicago has three questions in front of us. One is to understand exactly what happened over the last year in the city of Chicago. The second is to understand why. And the final question that's facing the city of Chicago is what we should do about ensuring that we have another year like the one that we just had. And I think most of the evening is going to be focused on trying to think of constructive ways for the city to move forward, but I wanted to try and set the stage initially by providing some context about what we know and don't know about the first two questions of what happened and why. If you look at the city of Chicago going back to 2010, we're a city of about 2.8 million people, and we have averaged something on the order of, say, 440 to 500 homicides per year. And that's what we've experienced up through 2015, and then 2016 happened. 2016 began in the very early morning hours of January 1st. About 2 miles from my own house on the south side of Chicago, there was a fight in the Bronzeville neighborhood that resulted in the fatal shooting, the murder of a 24-year-old named DeAndre Holliday. He was the first murder victim of 2016 in the city of Chicago. And unfortunately not the last. The city of Chicago experienced 12 people killed on Father's Day weekend alone in 2016. And we have averaged one school-age kid killed every week for the year of 2016. We went from 485 homicides in 2015 to 768 people murdered in the city of Chicago. That's an increase of 283 additional people who lost their lives in the city relative to 2015. As a way to think about what that number means, if you look at the city of New York, a city of 8.5 million people, nearly 3 times the population of Chicago, the total number of homicides in New York City in 2016 was 335. Put differently, the increase in homicides from 2015 to 2016 in Chicago, the increase is equal to almost the entire number of people killed in a city 3 times our size. What we are experiencing right now is not a complete breakdown in the social order. What we're going through is something that in many ways is a much more narrowly channeled challenge. You can see in this graph that shows the percentage changes in different types of crime in the city of Chicago from 2015 to 2016. And what you can see is what we're experiencing is a very large increase in gun crimes, lethal gun crimes in particular, and much more modest changes in violent crimes that don't involve firearms and in property crimes. And that pattern begins to tell us, so one thing that this pattern tells us is it helps us focus the city's attention moving forward. The problem is violent criminal behavior that involves firearms. And the other thing that this pattern begins to tell us is it gives us some clues about the why question, about what might be going on in the background that's causing this problem. For instance, if what was happening in the city of Chicago was dramatic changes in social conditions, in poverty or employment or in the social safety net, we would have expected to see much more broad-based changes in criminal behavior. We'd expect to have seen big increases in all sorts of crime, and that's not what we've seen. We've seen something that is much more narrowly targeted, gun violence disproportionately occurring in public places. The other, I think, critical characteristic of the change that we've seen in Chicago over the last year and a half is the suddenness. So this is a graph that is showing you month-by-month homicide counts in the city of Chicago for 2013, 2014, and 2015. And what you can see is that up through the end, as late as December 2015, no one in the city of Chicago would have thought that we were about to experience a dramatic change in the gun violence problem in the city of Chicago. December 2015 looked very similar to December 2013, to December 2014. And then we experienced a completely unexpected, dramatic increase in gun violence almost instantaneously, going from December 2015 to 2016. So you can see the red line here shows the month-by-month homicide counts for the city of Chicago. In 2015, we had 30 people murdered. We had 30 people murdered in January of 2015. That increased by 66% to 50 people murdered in January 2016. A very large increase, which also begins to help us understand what might be going on in the background to drive this. So there are many candidate explanations for why the city of Chicago is struggling with the gun violence problem. Many of those explanations don't fit the pattern that we're seeing because they don't change nearly abruptly enough to explain the sharp increase in gun violence. So for instance, we know that one important reason for gun violence in the city of Chicago is illegal guns coming in to the city from other jurisdictions that have more lax gun laws than Chicago does, places like Indiana. But the driving distance from downtown Chicago to Indiana did not change dramatically at the end of 2015. So we can take large chunks of explanations for why we are struggling with gun violence and rule them out for the 2016 event that we're experiencing because the timing just doesn't fit. The other thing that I think is very important to keep in mind about what the city of Chicago is going through right now is that this has really been a sustained problem. So you can see there's no sign in 2016 of this problem beginning to abate. And if you look into 2017, this is the yellow line here, 2017, unfortunately, looks much more similar to 2016 than it does to what Chicago used to look like. So this is a very serious challenge facing the city of Chicago and one that shows no signs of resolving on its own. Let me turn now to what we can say so far about why this has been happening in Chicago. One candidate explanation is the weather. If you are a Chicago resident, you realize that we've had some unusually warm winters in recent years, and it turns out that weather patterns can't explain this very large and sustained increase in gun violence that we've been experiencing. As I've mentioned, changes in city and state spending on the social safety net and on things like education also don't seem to explain what we're going through. That's turned people's attention to what has been going on with the Chicago Police Department. And this is a graph that shows you month by month arrest counts made by the Chicago Police Department going back to 2010. And what you can see here is that there has been a decline in arrests over time in Chicago. But it's been one thing that's characteristic about this trend is that it's been a slow, gradual decline, and it turns out that that's been largely driven by reductions in drug arrests made by the police department, which doesn't seem to fit the pattern that we're seeing of an increase in crime that's mostly concentrated in gun offenses. If you look at arrests made by the Chicago Police Department that you would think would be most relevant for the gun violence problem, arrests for homicide, you can see that that's largely been holding steady over time. So it doesn't look, any explanation that says what's going on is that Chicago Police Department has stopped working doesn't fit the data that we have. However, there has been one change in police activity that we have seen, and that is in the one measure of what you might describe as proactive policing that we can get. This is a measure of the number of street stops, investigatory street stops that the Chicago Police Department makes month by month. And what you can see is that very shortly before the January 2016 increase in gun violence, there was a very large reduction in the number of street stops that the police department was making. This has really turned into a litmus test, I think, in a national political debate about the criminal justice system in the United States, where people on the left have been arguing very strongly that there is absolutely no way that this could have anything to do with the increase in gun violence in Chicago, and people on the right arguing with equal conviction that this has to be, what else could it be? This is the only explanation. And my own view about this is that I think both of those arguments are dramatically overstating what we can conclude from the patterns that we're seeing in Chicago so far. I think the fact that this is one of the few big changes we've seen in the city of Chicago where the timing plausibly fits with the increase in gun violence means that it is a hypothesis that we have to take seriously. At the same time, we have the New York City experience that suggests that this is not a cut and dried, simple explanation. So many of you will know that in New York City, starting around 2011, a judge in New York ordered the New York Police Department to dramatically scale back their street stop activities, and that's the yellow line in this graph, and you can see what happened in New York. There was an equally dramatic decline in street stops in New York compared to what we've experienced in Chicago, but no accompanying increase in gun violence. Now, Chicago and New York are very different cities, so this also is not definitive evidence, but I would say anybody who claims that they know the role that this plays in the gun violence problem that we're facing, I think is not being intellectually honest in my view. Now, this leaves us in the somewhat unfortunate and I think unsatisfying situation of not being exactly sure what the explanation is for the increase that we're seeing in lethal gun violence across the city of Chicago. I think what, fortunately, and we'll hear this over the rest of the evening, fortunately, it does not need to be the case that the solution to the problem is the opposite of the cause. And I think we'll hear lots of promising ideas over the course of the evening about what the city can do to bring this problem under control. The final thing that I wanted to conclude with is just why I think this problem is so incredibly important. And one reason for that is the terrible human toll that this imposes on the city. Those of us who live in Chicago, we read the New York Times, we read the local newspapers, and we can see 6-month-old babies being shot, kids being shot, parents being shot. It's a terrible tragedy that's playing out across the city. And it's also one that represents, I think, in many ways, a critical threat to the long-term future of the city of Chicago. One of the reasons that cities all across the United States have thrived over the last 25 years is because crime rates have declined dramatically from the early 1990s. You can see the huge drop in homicide rates, for instance, in Chicago from the early 90s up until 2015. What we've experienced in the last 2 years has basically undone about 2/3 of the crime drop that we experienced over the past quarter century. Now, I will close by saying that the city of Chicago, if you think about crime rates per capita, the city of Chicago is not anywhere near the most violent city in the United States. You can see in this graph that the homicide rate per capita in Chicago is about middle of the pack. Our homicide rate is not nearly as low as what it is in New York and LA. On the other hand, our homicide rate is not nearly as high as what we see in cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and St. Louis. I think the critical question for the city of Chicago is we really are, in many ways, at a crossroads. Which direction Chicago goes, in the direction of New York or in the direction of a place like St. Louis or Detroit, I think is going to hinge very critically on a series of decisions that the city makes over the next several months and next several years. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome New York Times Chicago Bureau Chief Monica Davey and her guests.
Well, thanks to you all for being here with us, and thanks to you all for being here with us. Let's jump right in. Those were really jarring statistics that Jens laid out. So a natural question emerges. We've obviously got a law enforcement panel here. Let's just think about this in maybe 30 seconds or less, 60 seconds. Do we have a policing problem in Chicago? Why don't we start with you, Sean? You're not from here.
Yeah.
You work in LA.
Yeah. So, it's probably the fairest question to ask me because I'm not from here. And I have experience in other police departments as well, looking at data-driven strategies and evidence-based strategies and things that are community-focused. And I don't, perhaps I'm biased, I don't see this as a policing problem, something the police department did or didn't do to drive such a steep increase in homicides one year to the next. I think Jens is absolutely correct. If someone says they have the answer to that at this point, they're probably not telling you the truth. So the thing is, what do we do now? And I think what Chicago Police Department is doing now is the most important thing to talk about.
Kenneth, you obviously run one of the toughest districts we've got out in Englewood. Do we have a policing problem in Chicago?
No, I don't think we have a policing problem in Chicago. I think the members of the Chicago Police Department perform above and beyond every day their tasks, their duties to serve and protect the citizens of the city of Chicago. What I see in my district, in the 7th District, is a group of hardworking young men and women who go out every day to make a difference. And I think that that's their main driving force. They want to make a difference. They want to see a change in the community. They want to go out and make it better, to have a win. When they go out every day, they want to win the battle. So I think that that's their driving focus, and I think it's not a policing problem. I think it's the only thing I can see that they need is for me and for the department to support them, to give them the tools and the resources necessary to do a good job. And that's what I believe.
Kim Fox, you are obviously the state's attorney, newly elected state's attorney. What about you? You're a part of law enforcement, but do we have a policing problem?
I mean, I think to Jens's point, to oversimplify it and say that the issues with the violence in the community is just a policing problem undermines the totality of what's happening here. What we do have a problem, I think everyone would acknowledge, is the relationship that is necessary in order to combat violence requires law enforcement to work alongside community. There has been a significant shift in the views that the community has about law enforcement, and my office, the prosecutor's office included. And so I think what we've seen is to simply say that what's happened is all law enforcement. I think we do, however, have to acknowledge that the relationship between community and law enforcement, which is an absolutely necessary component to get to solutions, has been fractured. And unless we acknowledge that fracture and acknowledge both sides of it, I certainly work with hardworking assistant state attorneys in my office. However, we alone, if we cannot get the trust of the community to help us to believe that we are there to support them, that has community first, we will continue to have this conversation for years to come.
So if you had to give a grade to law enforcement in this community now, and that's a hard thing to do, but if you had to do it, what grade would law enforcement here get?
I've only been in office 5 months. They tell you from day one, don't give grades.
But we'll let you off the hook on that one. You go right ahead.
You know, listen, and I'm in law enforcement. You know, I think we're at a C. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that there's only so much that we can do alone. There's only so much effort and hard work that we have these great public servants going out to do, but without credible partnerships that are able to, to help you. A lot of the work that we do in law enforcement is driven by intelligence from people who live in communities. The ability to solve homicides, to get the homicide clearance rate up, requires not just great forensic work or work in labs or in police departments, but by people who live in neighborhoods. And the struggle that we have right now is that whatever we build, whatever technology we have, whatever new initiatives we have, if we do not have the buy-in from the public, if we do not have that credibility, we will not be able to reach A status. And I think that's where we are now. I think the effort from law enforcement in Chicago right now, the effort is an A. I think it only gets you so far in results if we don't have the complete puzzle.
All right. Commander Johnson, you work out in 7, and your twin brother, I guess, works in 11, so another tough district on the west side of Chicago.
That's correct.
And so tell us what you see out on the streets, what you're facing out there, what your guys and women are facing out there, and what could be done differently? What could happen differently?
What I see in the 7th District, we have a district which borders from 55th Street to the north, 75th Street to the south, from the Dan Ryan Expressway to Hamilton Avenue, which is just east of Western. We have over 69,000 residents in the district.
Right.
What I see could be done differently, and what I have challenged my office to do differently, we are very much into community engagement. That is my mantra, that is my focus. We can't proceed any further in the community without building that relationship with the police and the community. We can't stand apart. We cannot be seen simply as law enforcers. We can't just work in the community. They have to work with the community. I go out every day, talk to my officers. We're of the mindset of find out what's going on in neighborhoods. Talk to the residents. I think that's a lost art. We don't just get out, stop and say, hey, I'm Officer Johnson. How are you? What's going on in the neighborhood? How can we help you? Because it would be, in my opinion, it'd be wrong for me to go and say, okay, this is how we want your neighborhood to look. This is how we want your neighborhood to be perceived. We go out and ask, what do you want? How do you want your neighborhood? How safe do you want your neighborhood? And we have to be able to provide that. So we work hand in hand with all of our community groups in the district, the community organizations, the beat facilitators, the beat community meetings, even to just go out and talk to anybody in the street to say, hey, work with us to solve problems. And that's how we do.
But when you think back to the Laquan McDonald video and what that did to trust in the community, and you think back even to the Burge cases, and over the years, trust has really been shattered for so many people. And so how do you feel that those relationships are coming back between officers and people out there in the streets? Do they have trust in you all?
What I see in the 7th District since I've been there since August, I see that there's been a great shift in the trust, because now we're more open. We are about transparency. We're about working within the community, our community programs, and also to break down those silos. It can't be just the police and the community. We have to work together. Everybody has, one of my favorite phrases, everybody has some skin in this fight. So we have to get together, get down to the bare bones of what's going on, and try to come up with true solutions that are going to be not just quick fixes for a community. We just can't come in, okay, it's all right for now, and move on. We have to do something that's transformative. And we have to put ourselves in a position where the public believes in us once again, is able to trust us, and is willing to work with us. So that's what we do in 7.
All right. Chief Malinowski, Sean, I'm sorry, you told me to call you Sean, so
I did.
will.
I have trouble getting people to call me Sean. But
I know there's something hard about that. But so you bring the experience from LA. LA had frankly had fewer deaths last year and the year before than here in Chicago. What lessons can Chicago take from other places like LA?
Well, I think that it's been an exchange of ideas that we've had going on with the Chicago Police Department for over a decade. So when we started looking at crime forecasting, a lot of the folks that I work with on that work in Los Angeles are here in Chicago. The technology that they have here in Chicago far outstrips, frankly, what we are able to produce in Los Angeles. So I think that's the reason why my chief allows me to spend so much time here is he reminds me we have crime in LA also. But it's because to leverage the technology that they had here and to work with the commanders in the districts at the district level to build a data-driven, community-focused program, it's been successful from what I can see in terms of their acceptance of that partnership. And so I don't know that there's something that we can bring other than process. So when we talked to Jonathan Lewin from Information Technology, who's done a great job building out these situation rooms, what he says is they had developed great technology. They were lacking on process in how to use that technology in the field. But it did not take long. I mean, it was weeks to delivery. We brought in civilian analysts from the University of Chicago, paired them up with experienced officers from the street in these situation rooms, and it was a kind of a seamless partnership. So there's things that I'm learning every day from Chicago Police Department and things that we're bringing out here from Los Angeles in terms of process. And in fact, Sunday we have the superintendent coming out, and we're talking about strategic planning, and there's a lot of insights of value that I'm getting in return.
Mm-hmm. Help us understand the situation rooms. I think that's something that maybe everybody doesn't understand fully. This is not something that was in the districts until last year. Tell us about what's happening in 7. And you've got a situation room there, right? And you go in and figure out every morning what you're seeing overnight, and how does it affect what you're doing? Explain how these situation rooms work and how things have changed since last year.
Well, February began, we went live on the SDSC, which is Strategic Decision Support Center. The first 2 pilot districts were the 7th district and my brother's district, the Harrison district. In the situation room, there's a morning briefing that occurs. A lieutenant, a lot of my command staff in the district, my captain, the district intelligence officers, and the tactical lieutenant and the analyst from the University of Chicago. We all get together. We go over what's happened the previous day before, missions, activity, arrests, situations. Then we go in and look at what our predictive models are telling us about crime. And we also marry that with what's going on as far as the gunshot detection grid and what's going on at different shootings that have happened in different places. Using all that information and also now bringing information we receive from the community meetings, that if someone's saying that these guys, there's a gang trying to get a foothold in this area, or there's been a notable subject that was shot and how that affects crime in that area. We bring that all together, and I'm able to deploy resources or deploy officers to those locations to best handle that. So I think that the situation room has been, in my opinion, one of the best things we could have done as far as police and proactive policing is concerned. The officers now have a task. They're not just riding around looking up and down the street looking for things. Now they have a purpose, they have a focus. They know, okay, this area, we need to go over here, we need to see what's going on, try to address whatever situations are going on in that area. So now they have a purpose and a focus. They're not just doing random patrol. So now this gives them a sense of purpose, it gives them a direction, and it's also self-fulfilling because now they feel like they're completing something, they're not just spinning wheels. So the situation room has been, to me, is excellent.
So, but somewhere in there is a disconnect when you look at the numbers. There's still not a fantastic clearance rate, as Jens was describing. One thing that the Chicago police has started doing in these situation rooms is using more predictive policing techniques. You all have a list of if people are most likely to be shot or be shooters, they get a number on a list. Kim, what do you think about predictive policing?
You know, what I want to add that we're also doing in 7 and 11 that is different from the prosecutor standpoint is we now have assistant state's attorneys on the ground in those districts.
And what does that do? How does that help?
Well, it helps in that we have our assistants working earlier on cases as cases are being built. We worked out an agreement with the Chicago Police Department as well as the U.S. Attorney's Office, the DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and FBI, where now as we get information better in real time, there's a decision that can be made early on whether this is a case that will go federal or a case that will go state. The frustration that would happen when cases would be built up and presented for charging and there would need more information or this is not enough. Having assistants on the ground in there as the intelligence gathering is going to be able to build stronger cases. And then we're also doing something different in that we're prosecuting them vertically. So the assistant who is making that charging decision stays with that case throughout the life of the case, so that it's not a matter of just now you have it, it goes through 5 different hands before it ends up getting tried. It's the same assistant. And I think that that's been very helpful, and that collaborative relationship amongst law enforcement so that we can work out issues before it gets to the courtroom, so that we can learn in real time what's happening, helps us with our work as well. The State's Attorney's Office here in Cook County is the 2nd largest prosecutor's office in the country, and we are spread out. So Chicago is 2.8 million people, but Cook County is about 5.2. And so our office, being able to gather information about defendants who are on these lists, do they have a case in our gangs department? Do they have a case over in our child support division? Do they have a case in traffic? How do we pull all that information together to get a holistic picture of who it is that we're dealing with, and using that information to strengthen what we already have in the prosecutor's office? I think it's early to see how the predictive modeling works. I certainly think it's shown life in other jurisdictions where data-driven policing, data-driven prosecution has shown an impact on driving down those who cause the most violence. And so I certainly think it's worth the effort in looking at.
Is it fair?
I mean, I think there's no simple answer of numbers and algorithms are able to predict human behavior. I think one of the things that we've learned, if anything, we've learned in the last several years about the gun violence that we've seen, the influence of social media, the deconstruction and reconfiguration of gang culture in Chicago, that a lot of it is not just about drugs and turf, but is about petty slights, or it's about bravado on social media, that those are things that you can't predict by an algorithm. Those are human behaviors, that's influenced by outside factors. And so, I too am wary about the notion that we can use algorithms to determine, behaviors. We have to look at individuals. But I certainly think we need to narrow our focus because we do know that there's a smaller number of people who are driving the violence, and the targeted blanketing communities and that rift that we see with communities because we're stopping everyone, we're treating everyone like a potential defendant, has a far more detrimental effect than trying to narrow the scope.
Predictive policing, is it fair and does it work?
Yeah, so as we've been working on predictive policing over the last decade or so, there's 2 ways to go with it. There's people or offender-based, and then there's place-based. And Los Angeles was largely a place-based shop for some of these
Can you
reasons.
explain that? I don't think everyone understands. What you're saying is that you guys look and see, hey, what location is most likely to be where the crimes are happening, and let's go there.
Yes.
Whereas Chicago had been looking at the people and saying which people are most likely to be shot or shoot.
That's right. And so that's a perfect example of how we are collaborating. So they had a history of working on offender-based, so where they look at the predictors in a person's criminal history and other factors that put them at risk. It's really about who's likely to be a victim of violence. And we know just from research that the people who are most likely to be a victim of the violence oftentimes are involved as suspects in the violence. So they've done a lot of work in that area, and they have very good information on who's most likely, so it does narrow the focus. And I think that's the point in what they're trying to do. We didn't have as good an apparatus for that in Los Angeles, but we are very good at figuring out where the violence is going to occur. So what we try to do in Los Angeles and what they're doing in Chicago and accepting widely now through the rooms is putting out missions based on where violence is most likely to occur. And what we find out is that is highly predictable, where the violence would occur over time. So we use data that comes in and put a forecast out, and we put officers in those places to deny the criminal the opportunity to shoot someone. So it's pretty simple, and I have to give a lot of credit to the Chicago Police Department, because the amount of time, or what I call dosage, so we diagnose a problem, and we put a dose of officer minutes on that problem, and the presence of the officer denies the criminal. And so what we saw in the 7th District is we put predictive policing in place. The officers accepted it in a way that we didn't even see in Los Angeles. They spend a lot of time policing those areas. And in Inglewood, in February, we turned this on, right? February 1st. You're not going to say it because you don't want to take credit for it. But the thing is, we turned this on the 1st of February, and we went 12 days in Inglewood without one shooting. So this is a place that has daily shootings. Then we had a few days, right? 3 or 4 days where we got shootings. Then we went 13 days without a shooting because officers were in the right place at the right time, I believe, and narrowing the focus on particular suspects. So it's the opposite of a dragnet. So when you go in a place like Inglewood, in the month of February, you have 28 days, and 25 of them you don't have a shooting. Even the most cynical police officer who says, well, there's no way we can predict this thing, starts to change the way they're thinking. And they are delivering a lot of dosage into these areas. And it's not arrest-based, and it's not necessarily stop-based. It's presence and absence of crime.
So, I mean, it sounds great. The situation rooms, the idea that there's more predictive policing going on, the fact that there are state's attorneys right there in the districts. Should Chicagoans be feeling the change? Shouldn't we be feeling this directly? When are we going to?
So I always end up talking about the numbers. And the thing is, there is a change that's happening in the 7th and 11th district, and now 4 more districts. So if you look at the numbers, and besides just the days without a shooting, what you'll see is a 35% reduction in shootings in 7 and 11 combined. At the same time, if you look at the rest of the city and exclude 7-11, it's a 6% reduction. So we have fewer victims. Right now, 127 fewer people shot in the city of Chicago this year versus last. And now homicides are about even, but there's a lot of factors, as everybody knows, that affect homicide. But the shootings are down. We have to keep the focus on reducing the number of shooting victims. In these 2 districts alone, out of 127 fewer victims, 86 fewer of those victims come from 7 and 11. So something is happening. I think it's too early to tell. The university, we have them involved in the project because they can talk to us from a data standpoint that it is too early to tell, but certainly something is happening. And I don't think they're getting enough credit for that, and I don't think they get enough credit really for taking guns off the street. Last year, Chicago police officers took 8,000 guns off the street. So that's 8,000 times they confronted someone with a weapon in their possession and removed that weapon from them. And anytime that my guys in Los Angeles talk about Chicago and what are those guys doing, I say, how many guns did you get off the street last year? And the answer is 4,000.
So Chicagoans should be proud of that, huh? That
well, the more guns off the street, the fewer people that are getting shot. Understood.
So we're talking a lot about policing because this is a law enforcement panel, but what other groups could be stepping up, and who else can solve this problem?
You know, I think it's an all hands on deck situation here. So there's not a group that can't solve this problem. I think what we've been talking about on some of the predictors that we've seen, when we've seen some of the social service safety net go by the wayside. We haven't had a state budget in 2 years here. In Illinois, some of the programming that we need and that we have shown results, particularly with youthful offenders, we don't have the ability to deal with. I think, you know, the faith-based communities, you know, we have in a lot of the neighborhoods where violence runs rampant, we have a lot of faith organizations, we have a lot of churches, we have a lot of people who are on the ground, schools, restorative justice programming in schools, cognitive behavioral therapy in schools, help deal with some of the issues that we see on the outside. I think it goes back to the point that I made earlier to suggest that it is only a law enforcement solution absolves the responsibility for all of us in whatever sector we're in to be able to own a piece of this. And I think when we look at the issues that drive violence outside of just one particular year, we know the role that poverty plays, we know the role that education plays, we know the role that race plays, and I think we haven't had honest conversations about all of those things and have simply said that this is a matter of law enforcement not solving anything. If we continue to have neighborhoods with skyrocketing unemployment rates, with low economic investment, with the absence of public health and mental health treatment, and suggest that we've done a good job with guns that year, we're just waiting for the powder keg the following year. So I think what other people can do is know that those other areas that have a direct impact on violence, step up and say, we want to do more around public health, funding for drug addiction and treatment. Stop using the jail system to do that. If you want to do something about mental health, let's invest more in mental health services and not shut them down. If you know that we need children engaged in activities, let's fight to get funding for those types of services. So I think it really is an all hands on deck issue, and we have to start talking about violence in its totality and not just the individual crime and the individual response. Once law enforcement is involved, it's late. When we're talking about responding to homicides, someone's dead already. And my work in this area, I've worked in child protection, I've seen kids who come through our foster care system, who graduate to our delinquency system, who graduate to our adult system. We are touching a lot of these young people very early. And when we do sadly, the post-mortem of these folks who've died, and we look back over their lives, and it's like, where could we have intervened? If we are continuing to wait to intervene once someone has shot or been killed, it's far too late. And I think everyone has a responsibility on that.
Any thoughts on who else could step up?
I'd like to piggyback on what Ms. Fox stated. The word that resonates to me so clearly is responsibility. It's responsibility of the police to do our jobs, to be professional, to be legitimate in what we do, and to be open and transparent in our operations. I also feel there's a responsibility for the community. The community has to step in and not just lay it on the police shoulders for their neighborhood.
That's right.
We have to work together. We have to be open with one another and willing to make that leap of faith to work together. And I think that's going to solve a lot of the problems we have in the community. Tell you a quick story. When I first took over the Inglewood district, I like to ride around the district and see what's going on, just because I don't like to rely on what they're telling me, what's happening. Hey, boss, this is going on, this is going on.
Right.
Let me go see firsthand what's happening. So I'm riding around, I stop at a block club party in the neighborhood. I get out and I walk and I introduce myself to the citizens on the block and I say, hey, how you doing? I'm Commander Johnson. I like for people to have a name to a face so you know who you're dealing with, to make that connection. Well, I'm standing there and a little boy comes up. He had to be about 4 or 5 years old. He comes up and he taps me on my leg and he says, hey, officer, can I give you a hug? So I knelt down, over 50, but I knelt down and gave the young man a hug. And he said, thank you, and he walked away. His father walked up to me and he said, look, officer, my son, when he saw you come on the block, he spoke to me and he said, Daddy, can I go give that policeman a hug? Because I don't want to be afraid of the police. That resonated to me in such a way till I realized that this is what I need to do and what I need to challenge my officers to do. We have to step out of who we are as police officers and recognize that everyone is a human being. We have to have respect, trust, honesty, and most of all, the faith to believe that together we can make a difference out here. And that's what I like to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. maybe it's not fair to ask you the question. Send us some LA community groups to help us, but any quick thought on who else
I
is
think
responsible?
what I think is encouraging. So I came in from outside, so I'm doing an assessment, and what I'm seeing is that the superintendent, Eddie Johnson, all the way down through the commanders in the districts, there are plans in place to deal with this violence problem. And the plans are data-driven to some extent, and they're community-focused as well. And so those plans are being carried out, and you see the commitment when you talk. If you talk to every one of the district commanders that I've spoken to, they will say very similar things about community relations and why it's so important. So people have no illusion on the Chicago Police Department that this is all enforcement-based. They believe in the fact that like Kim said, the enforcement's only going to get us so far. What we're trying to do in this situation, and the superintendent has talked about this, he said, what we need to do is stop this violence, and they have, if you really think about the steep upward trajectory of violence that Jens talked about, there was no expectation that would level off, right? When I came here in September, October, no, that steep trajectory was going to continue by anyone's estimation. That's been blunted now, and I believe what the department is on the move now to level that off, have people come out of their homes, meet those safety needs, and as they come out of their homes, meet them with a robust community engagement program. And so that is what we're moving toward right now under the leadership of Eddie Johnson and the commanders in the districts.
Okay, I think we're going to take some questions in just a minute, but let me give you guys one quick speed round thought. If you could be in charge of the world for a day and you could do one thing to change the violence in Chicago, to bring it down, just change one thing, what would it be? It's unfair to go to the first person because they haven't had time to think about it. But Commander Johnson, why don't you jump in?
To change the gun violence?
Yeah, one thing that would help fix this.
I'd say the gun prosecutions, being able to put stiffer penalties as far as when offenders are arrested.
Well, tell our audience a little bit more about that. When you get arrested for possession, what are you likely to get here? If you have a gun, and a gun that you're illegally possessing, are you going to go to prison for that? Or
we prosecute, we send gun arrests for prosecution. It varies on the subject's history, time and place, things like that. So we just wanted it to be, if I had it, if it was me, I would have it. Whereas we would have strict guidelines of how it goes. It wouldn't be as arbitrary as it has in the past, and I believe that with City Attorney Fox, things are going to be much better. That there are actually penalties for those who really are driving the violence in the city.
Sean, you're in charge for one day. What would you do?
Well, I think one of the things we saw in Los Angeles is once you get a handle on the violence that's happening and people feel safe, if you can intervene with these meaningful, like we have gang reduction and youth development program, and we have a team coming out from Chicago, and they're actively talking to the folks in the mayor's office in Los Angeles, and there's great programs here that are being planned for jobs and mentoring and things that follow on so that everyone, like you've said, has skin in the game, and everyone feels supported in the community, because we know we're not going to be able to arrest our way out of this problem. We're not going to be able to use an algorithm to get ourselves out of this problem. We have to intervene with the youth before they get in those, crime-prone years.
Okay, Kim.
Yeah, I agree with Sean. I think if I had my way, we would be spending equal amounts of time on prevention and intervention than we do on reaction. And particularly as it relates to young people who are coming through the system. I think we have an overbalance of dealing with adults who are driving a lot of violence. But if we looked at the age range between 16 and 24, 16 and 28, and see that large segment, and again, it's a very reactive strategy that we've been dealing with. So if I had my way, I'd really invest and enforce more around early intervention for young people, particularly in neighborhoods that have high incidence of violence.
Do we just need much more money devoted to that? What is missing? There's so many programs out there.
I don't know that it's necessarily money. I think it's a matter of priority. I think when you recognize what the issues are, I think it's where do we put our priority dollars? If we know that we have a lot of people, say for example in adults, when we have an issue, a public health issue as it relates to drug addiction,
Right.
the response to the drug addiction crisis in Illinois and across the country hasn't been to deal with more treatment facilities, it's to make more beds in our jails. And so what are our priorities? If we believe that we have public health issues dealt with in the criminal justice space, then it means we don't care about the public health piece if we're not investing in public health. And I think the reallocation of dollars, you know, we don't have to find new money, though we do need new money. And with that, you know, there's been a lot of talk, and Chicago's been the focus. You know, I wrote a letter to the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, several weeks ago. This notion of people wanting to come in and fix Chicago. And the fix doesn't come by way of tanks and men carrying guns. It comes by way of meaningful investments in prevention and intervention, and the research that has come with it, whether it's DOJ or, you know, juvenile justice, that has looked at these issues and has been validated and verified that these interventions work, the work that UFC does. There's mechanisms to do something about that. Again, if it were me, our response, and I certainly would hope from a national perspective, is not this knee-jerk militaristic way that we're going to solve issues in community. It will worsen the problem significantly if that is the narrow scope that we look at.
Okay, let's take some questions now that I've given you not enough time to do that.
And thank you for all your questions. There's so many, and they're all great. This one from Katie Norman Burke. It's about the phenomenon of fragmentation of gang leadership and the challenges that creates, and what can you do about that?
You want to handle that?
Well, the gang, we have, I'll say in the 7th District, for example, we have at least 50 different gang factions within the district. And many of those factions are broken down in different subsets. So it's very hard to identify who they are because they could change from day to day. We have one gang that could be classified as something, and then a subset will break off. Then another subset, because this guy got killed, now they want to name themselves after this group, and so now they're all fighting this, the internal and the external gang conflicts, which are historical and very well entrenched in the community. So we have to work on strategies to, first of all, identify who is involved in these particular gangs and find methods to reach out to, first of all, we're not going to arrest our way out of the situation, as Sean said. We can't arrest our way out of this. So we have to come up with methods in the custom notifications, in the gang call-ins that we do. With the community outreach, I just had a meeting 2 weeks ago with 4 gang factions. And I just simply asked them, and I was really shocked that they came. You know, we all sat in a church and we talked, and let's just put it all on the table. And they really want to end the violence. They really want to end the violence. They want to find a way. And moreover, many of them said, hey, Commander, how can we work with you? Because too many of our children are getting shot. Yeah. You know, their relatives, friends, young children, the young lady who got shot over by Henderson School, the 12-year-old, that really kicked off the conversations. So now that we're in a point where we can talk to one another, that's not adversarial, and that we treat each other with mutual respect and understanding, I think we'll come up with some true solutions to kind of make a difference.
And you know, really quick on that, there is good work being done to monitor these, as these factions are fighting with each other. The work that they've done through David Kennedy and Chris Millett here with violence reduction strategy to talk about every single shooting and what drove that shooting. That's great work that's being done in 11 and being spread now through the cooperation with the university into other districts.
Just a quick question. How do you organize a meeting like that?
Well, to be honest, the factions asked me to come. They wanted to reach out. They met with some intermediaries in the district, some of our community stakeholders, and said, we want to talk to the commander and see what we can do. And I was more than willing to do that.
Okay. We have a number of questions, including from Facebook. Arililla asks about, really about the laws for lesser crimes and the idea that if people are arrested for these lesser crimes, and that becomes part of the record, that then they're on a pathway into sort of a criminal lifestyle. So can you folks address that?
Yes.
Maybe Kim?
Sure. Yes. There are collateral consequences to having a record, a felony record. And those consequences last a very long time. So if we look at, and I talk about, the public health issues with drugs a lot, because tends to be more empathy. People tend to know someone who's had that struggle. If you look at that conviction, what happens with a felony conviction, say for possession of drugs, that conviction will preclude you sometimes, or most times, from public housing, for the ability to get a job with some measure of ease, for assistance with education. There was a study that was done a few years ago here that they called it $1 Million Blocks, and it was, I believe it was UIC, that was looking at the number of dollars that we spent on incarceration based on where people were returning to those neighborhoods. So one of the neighborhoods that they looked at was Austin, which was driving a lot of violence on the west side of Chicago, and found that we'd spent somewhere over $40 million on incarceration in Austin. And so when we look at the neighborhoods that have, if we did the heat map of where people who are returning from prisons are, and most people return from prison, they move into the same zip codes. And when you look at the lack of investment in those neighborhoods, and again, people go where they're able to be, those consequences determine your outcome and really the generations behind you, because you're continuing to live in those areas. And so we're trying in the State's Attorney's Office here to be more mindful and looking at ways to hold people accountable for their actions, but making sure, to the language that was used earlier, the dosage is appropriate. We have to have the right dosage in our response to issues, and that means looking at mental health as a mental health issue, and is there a way to divert more people out? Talking about diversion as a meaningful tool in as much as we talk about sentencing. Diverting people into appropriate treatment protocols is just as important as sentences on the background.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Now I'd like to bring out my colleague, John Eligo, and his panel.
Anush, you're next.
Hey, come on. Good to see you, sir. All right, bless you. Great job. Hey, what's going on? Hey, what's going on? Hi, how are you doing? Good to meet you. Good to meet you. Hey, sir. How you good? You good? God, jeez. There's a lot of people out here.
Hey, everyone, how's it going? Sorry, Arnie had to say a bunch of hellos back there. He's a popular guy, apparently. Well, thank you all again for joining us. We're very excited. You all are very lucky here to have a panel. This is a great panel because these gentlemen have all been on the ground. They've seen things, they've been there in the belly of the beast. So, we can talk about some social service solutions and whatnot. And I wanted to start off, the first panel, they were talking about law enforcement. I think the first question to them was, is it a law enforcement problem? And I think, the sentiment there was that it's more than that. I want to ask each of you, give me one thing that you think is at the core of the gun violence problem in Chicago. I'm going to start with you, Arnie? Or are you still right?
Sure. Can I give two? Cheat.
Yeah, you can cheat.
One and a half.
That's all right.
At the heart of the gun violence problem is guns.
Makes sense.
If we get rid of the guns, we would have no problem. The second one is, this is not, for me, a crime problem, it's an economic crisis. And we have to employ young men. We have to give them a chance to make a living in the legal economy. And if we're not willing to meet them halfway, they have to eat. These are men, not boys. They have to take care of their families. They have to have a roof over their head. If we're not willing to meet them halfway, we give them no choice other than to stay in the street economy, which sadly almost inevitably leads to violence.
Yeah. Autry, one problem, one and a half, what you got for me?
I think the biggest problem that we have is the fact that we have to realize that there is not a Chicago problem with shooting. There's a community problems with shootings. And what I mean by that is this. Most of the shootings happen in African American and brown communities. If you are in Chicago and you drive down Ashland from 79th Street to the south to Webster to the north, you will see the tale of two worlds, not two cities, but two worlds. Opportunity is the word that I would use to say that is the problem with the gun violence in Chicago, is that the people that live on the south side of Chicago don't have the same opportunities as the ones who live on the north side of Chicago. That would be my opening statement.
All right, yeah, definitely. I definitely want to get back to talk about that disparity, because I mean, really, if you're living on the north side, it's a different world than on the south side. Anuj, what do you think? What's at the core of this?
So I think a lot of times when you look at a reason for a specific shooting or a specific homicide, it sometimes seems like there's an intense act of violence over something that seems, at least from an outsider's perspective, very small. And so when you're then asking, okay, why did somebody pull a trigger over something so small, a lot of us start with the assumption that, well, that must be a fundamentally bad person who just needs a totally new social orientation or a new set of values. But instead, what our research is showing and what the research from a lot of other groups is suggesting is that a lot of times these are just people who are caught up in violence, who are caught up in a moment where they make a split-second decision. If you asked them 5 minutes later if they could take it back, they often would. And so for us, then the task is, the challenge is to try and find ways to give people back that time so they can make better decisions. It's not about bad people, it's about mistake.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, opportunities. We talked about jobs and work, and Arnie, obviously you're involved with the Emerson Collective. You all are, aggressively going after job creation. And maybe it's just because I'm a journalist. I'm a very cynical person. And I've heard program after program, people have tried programs, say I'm going to provide this many jobs and that many jobs. Why is yours going to work? Like, what's going to be different about yours that all these others haven't been able to solve?
And the truth is we don't know. And we're making mistakes every single day and learning hard lessons. I'll tell you what we're trying to do, and there's no guarantees of success in any of this, but I'd sure rather be caught trying than being on the sidelines right now. First of all, I just want to say this is an existential crisis for our city, and I can't overstate how serious this is. And this is not something we can just talk about in nice auditoriums like this. The reality of our young kids on the south and west side, it is fundamentally unfair. And the level of fear and trauma they're living with is hard for folks in this room to imagine. And so we got to try lots of things. We got to be willing to fail. We got to improve and take those lessons. But this is not one where we can just sort of sit back and academically study this for 5 years and just see kids continue to die. We can't do it. So I want to fail.
What are some of the bold things that you're going to do to not fail?
Pieces that we're trying to, again, it's not to not fail, it's to try and get as much success as we can and improve, and I'm willing to fail. And we're frankly failing probably in pieces every single day. 3 things. One is, while I've been in prevention all my life on the education side, we got to keep doing that. We cannot simply work on the prevention side. We have to work with those most at risk of shooting and being shot, which is young black men primarily, not exclusively, 17 to 24, 25, 26. We cannot solve this at the middle school level. We should do that too. We've got to work directly with that population. That's one. Secondly, as I said, this is an economic issue. We got to give people a chance to earn real money in the legal economy. The third thing is the jobs by themselves are important, but it's insufficient. These guys have often lived with trauma all their life and have lived with a pain and a loss that, again, is hard for folks, hard for me to understand, to really try and comprehend. I try, but I can't say that I do. So social and emotional support, trauma care, housing, substance abuse. You got to couple the wraparound services with real economic opportunity. One without the other, I don't think gets there. The job without support, you can't handle it. The support without a job, where you're forcing guys to go back to the street. Our strong belief is that the combination of those two and working with the guys who most need these opportunities, that's what's going to give us a chance to do this. The final thing I'll say is that while we're still very small, and 2 cohorts of guys, and we're going to start to expand, we got to be thinking about this much more aggressively on a citywide basis. There are not 10,000 guys out there doing this. If we could provide jobs for 2,000 guys, I think that changes everything. And for a city this wealthy, with this many resources, to not commit to hiring 2,000 guys, for me, it's we're part of the problem. We're part of the problem.
And certainly, there's people out there who want to work. I've done a lot of reporting in Chicago on the violence, and I meet all these young men who are always coming to me asking about jobs.
There's no shortage of guys looking for an opportunity.
Yeah. But Anuj, I wanted to ask you, a lot of times we talk about providing social skills. It's great to provide someone a job and education and whatnot. But the research you've done, does it show that it goes beyond social skills and providing that? What else needs to be provided to maybe help some of these young men and women avoid violence?
Yeah, so in the spirit of trying to find ways to give people time to reflect on their decision making, so with the Crime Lab, we've been evaluating a few different programs that are based on principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, and these are youth anti-violence programs. And even though they're based on principles of therapy, they don't really look like therapy per se. Instead, a lot more of these programs are about having kids go through exercises where they get into a hot or agitated state, and the counselor steps in to get kids to reflect on the decisions that they're making or reflect on the assumptions that they're making about a situation. And we found that these programs can reduce arrests for violent crimes by as much as 45%. They reduce arrests for total crimes by about 30%. They increase school engagement such that you're now seeing increases in graduation rates from anywhere from 12 to 19%. And what's amazing is that it's not about giving them a whole new orientation to the world. So here's just one example of what they do in these programs to give you a flavor of the lessons they're trying to teach. So in one of the programs that we evaluated, it's called BAM, Becoming a Man. It was developed by Youth Guidance, a nonprofit here in Chicago. And on the very first day in that program, they pair up young men, and they're part of a group. They pair up the young men, and they'll give one young man a ball, and they'll tell his partner, they'll say, here's what I want you to do. So he tells the first young man, make a fist around that ball, and he says to their partner, I want you to do whatever it takes for the next minute to get the ball from the other kid. And you can imagine what happens over the next minute. All hell breaks loose, right? These kids are scratching at each other, they're punching at each other, and when that minute is done, the counselor says, okay, what did you guys do? The kids talked about how they physically punished the other kid until they did or did not give up the ball. And then the counselor asks what we might think of as kind of a corny question. The counselor says, well, how many of you just thought to ask for the ball? And no kid raises their hand.
And let's be honest here. How many of you all initially said, oh, let me ask? Y'all were thinking, I want to grab that ball too, right?
John wanted us to do the exercise, and I was like, I don't think we should do that.
Yeah, because I was thinking, I'm getting that ball. And I know Arnie would have, because being a basketball player, I know you would have found a way to get that ball. Yeah, but yeah. I'm sorry, Anuj, go ahead.
No, and so then the counselor goes around to the guys who started with the ball, and he says, what would you have done if they asked you for the ball? And these kids are like, I'm not a psychopath. I don't need this ball. If they'd asked me for the ball, I would have given it to them. And that's just one example of how the counselors will get these kids to notice the assumptions they make very quickly when they're thinking fast. And the rest of the program is about trying to get kids the skills they need to slow down. But it's not about telling kids what to do. It's about giving them the tools they need to decide for themselves, which is a rather different approach.
Now, Audrey, some real talk here. Your organization, you all go on the streets and talk to young men. Like I said, I've been on the South Side, and sometimes there's receptiveness. A lot of times there's not.
Right.
Take me on the street with you. Tell me, what do you say to these young brothers sitting on the corner? Just take us through that approach. Like, what do you say? Like, you could even pretend I'm someone sitting on the corner. Like, what would your initial engagement be, and where do you take it from there?
Yeah. First of all, I would just want to address the CBT version of this great thing. I'm so happy to be sitting between two great people, and I get to talk behind these guys. But real quick, the cognitive behavior therapy is very important, but on the street, we, in my organization, haven't had the time to actually understand what that is. But as we understand it more, we find out as community-based organizations that work on the street at street level intervention, we call it care. We care about the individuals who are on the street that John is getting ready to ask me to talk about. We never called it CBT. We called it, I'll be your brother until you can get another brother that's been shot. I'll help you through this particular time. I'll hold your hand as you get through your crisis at this time. We didn't call it CBT. We just called it care. We just cared about the person that was standing in front of us that was hurting. As street level intervention workers, our job is to prevent the next shooting, but more importantly, prevent the shooting on the front end. A lot of the work that we do, you don't hear about it because it never happened. A lot of people keep talking about this thing called evidence-based. You're asking individual organizations who are on the front line trying to keep the doors open, and you're asking them to do an evidence-based evaluation of your work. Here it is, a community-based organization who's struggling to keep the doors open. Now you want me to do an evidence-based. Our evidence is that the people on our street and on our blocks are still alive. John, you asked me to walk you through what we would do if you were a guy on a corner.
Yeah.
It all depends on why you're on the corner. And the question is this, is that we would walk up to you and just say hi. I mean, it's no secret sauce on what we do. It's really just treating individuals on the corner, check this out, as human beings. They're not special people that came from Mars. They're somebody's sister, they're somebody's brother. And if we treat them differently, they will act differently. But if we treat them like human beings, they will become what? Who they are, human beings. The reason why I believe target area and groups like ours are so successful is that we are actually on the street treating individuals who carry guns or in the environment to actually shoot someone or get shot. We treat them like human beings. And the question that we ask them, why do you carry a gun? Honestly, they would rather have a gun or be caught with a gun than be caught without one. And the thing is this, they would rather get arrested for having a gun than to be caught on the corner without their gun. So the problem is the opportunities. The reason why they're out there anyway is because they don't have the same opportunities as their brothers and sisters on the other side of town. Let's just be real. If we're going to be here, let's just be real.
And on that, when someone says hi, when you say hi, what generally do you get from them in response, and what do you have to offer them? Because I can oftentimes see someone saying like, what does this dude want? Like what?
Exactly, and we get that a lot. What do you want? And the question, our response to that is not what we want, is what we can do for you. We're there to be a resource to individuals who feel hopeless. We're there to bring hope to hopeless situations. We're not there to sprinkle magic dust and make all their problems go away, but we're there to make sure that they understand that there's someone here that when you get ready to change your mind and change your life, there is someone that's at 1542 West 79th Street that's willing to help you do that. We're not trying to tell you to put a gun down because we understand you got to eat. We're not trying to tell you to stop selling drugs, but we understand you got to eat. But what we are saying is that if you continue doing what you're doing, you're going to continue to get what you're getting. So we got to convince you to stop doing what you're doing.
Now, Arne, I want to ask you, kind of piggybacking off what he just said, a lot of these young men who, maybe they don't want to stop carrying them, maybe they don't want to meet you halfway. How do you get to those who are at the highest risk? Those ones who you may say, I got a job for you, and their initial response is like, I don't care, I don't give a crap. Like, how do we get to those highest risk individuals, I think?
So again, none of us are going to bat 1,000 or bat 100%, but we got to try with everybody. And anecdotally, I will tell you, not the majority, but the vast majority of guys are looking to make a change. Mm-hmm. It is too dangerous out there. They're tired of being shot at. They're tired of the police chasing them. And there's a myth that all these guys are making a lot of money on the street. And they're not, none of these guys are getting rich. I keep looking for the guys making all the money. I can't find them. I'm sure there are a couple. And so I just absolutely agree. I think guys have made a series of rational choices starting about 12 or 13 where they became the men of their homes, where mom was, on crack or alcoholic, dad is gone or locked up, and they had to make some money. And there was one person hiring, and that was the guy in the corner. And all of us in rooms like this, we were all absent. We weren't there. Right. That's our fault. And they made the rational choice of last resort, one choice. All we're trying to do is present a second rational choice, and the vast majority of guys are open to doing that. I go to Cook County Jail about once a month, and every time I test myself. I say, we want you to get off the street. We want you to stop shooting. What's that price point? We all got a price point to change our behavior. It's $12, $13. It's peanuts. It's peanuts. These guys are not getting rich. So our first cohort of guys, we're paying $15 an hour. Our second, we actually started at like $10.50, and we're going to work higher. We got waiting lists. People want to, no one's winning out there right now. There's a desperation, and again, if we don't meet them halfway, shame on us. There's in every crisis, there's an opportunity. There's a massive opportunity. And just to walk through the math, if we wanted to hire the strategic subject list, SSL, makes some sense, not perfect, but it's assessment of risk. If we were to hire, offer jobs, and again, they wouldn't all take them, offer jobs to 2,000 guys most at risk, that's $50 million. That's peanuts. That's peanuts. Sounds like a big number. We can't do that as a city. We can't do it. And think if we reduced the risk of the 2,000 guys most at risk right now in the city, what would that do for the city's violence? There aren't 30,000 guys running around. The numbers aren't that big. Just, again, we're going to try and do this from the private side and philanthropy, and we're going to try and get this done, but at some point this has to transfer to the public sector. Just rough math between the Chicago Police Department's budget, Illinois Department of Corrections, and Cook County Sheriff, that's about $4 billion annually. $50 million is 1.25%.
Wow.
We can't try and give guys a chance to make a legal dollar and instead lock them up at the back end. We're crazy.
Well, why aren't we meeting them halfway, be it in the private sector or the public sector?
It's a great question. I think we're scared. I think we don't see these young men as human beings of tremendous talent and potential and resilience that I can't imagine. I think we're, talk about their being hopeless. I think sometimes we feel hopeless, and I'm really hopeful. Mm-hmm. I'm really confident. And again, we're happy to lock people up at Cook County Jail at $55,000, $60,000 per bed per year, right. And we won't hire somebody at $12, $13, $14 an hour. Right. For me, it's a simple trade. It's a simple trade, and we just haven't had the courage to do that. And again, for those, this is not a get out of jail. For those that do something crazy, the police have to do their job. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to shrink what the police have to do from this many guys to this many and bring the vast majority with us.
Yeah, you mentioned sometimes we don't want to see them as human. Anuj, I'm wondering, is there a point where young men and women are too far gone or can no longer be saved?
So at least our research suggests that not really. So I talked about that one program that we evaluated that's being done in schools. And so kids who are still showing up to school aren't so far gone. But then we also evaluated a similar program that's being done in the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. And so those are kids who are much more at risk, or they've already made bad decisions. And what's interesting there is that the youth development specialists there often start with that sort of care or the human approach that Audrey mentioned. So we talked to one youth development specialist, and he says, I tell my guys that, look, 9 out of 10 of you, you don't need to be here. If I could give you back 10 minutes of your life, you would make a different decision and you wouldn't be here. Some of you might be bad kids, but most of you aren't. And they take that same approach that they're doing in Chicago public schools. It looks a little different. They don't let them fight over things. But even there, you find that this program, this approach, is having positive effects. So it reduces recidivism rates by as much as 21%, 18 months out. And so this is a very at-risk population, and even there you're seeing that this intervention or this approach is having similar positive effects. That suggests no, there may not be a point at which most people are too far gone.
Do we generally know what type of social interventions work and what don't?
I think we know for sure that if you go to the clearinghouse of what works, that a lot of things we know don't have a strong evidence base for whether they work or not. Mm-hmm. And so I understand that it creates a strong burden on social programs when they're trying to keep the doors open to be able to evaluate them. But to the extent that we are able to actually start building up this evidence base and be able to say what works and what doesn't, that's a contribution. It's not something that every social program might have the means to do, though.
Gotcha. And as you mentioned, social programs, Arnie, you're working on one. Autry, you've got one too. Do we have too many social programs? Do we have too many programs? Autry?
Will we answer that?
Yeah, please.
No. Well, what I'm saying is that we have, and again, I use this word opportunity, we have an opportunity to, in my opinion, fund the right programs. Fund the programs that you know of the individuals and the credibility and the character of the person that's running the program. If you want to know how well an institution is doing, look at its leader. If you want to know how well an institution is doing, look at its leader. What we're saying about this is this. Street level intervention is what we do. We don't cater to after-school program kids. We don't cater to the kids that go to Bible class. We don't cater to those individuals. Street-level intervention programs are about the top 1% of the individuals who's on the street, who's actually literally wake up in the morning in order to shoot somebody else. So when you talk about street-level intervention, you cannot put us in the same category as after-school programs. Two different worlds.
But let me push back on, whether we have, because there's obviously you said you don't have too many, but there's finite resources out there. And the work that you all do, you could probably do it in cohesion with some of these other programs and whatnot. So that's what I'm saying. Is there this lack of coordination because everybody's fighting for the dollar, no one's coordinated? Where's the plan there for all these?
Let me back out you on this one. I would love to get to the point where we're bumping heads and we're duplicating services and there's redundancy. That would be a great problem to have. We are so far from that world. And the truth is, nobody is reaching these guys at scale the way we need to be. Right. And again, it's not 20,000 guys, but it's 2,000 maybe. And nobody's working, or almost nobody's working with them. And so what we're trying to do is scale as fast as we can and do this, and then at some point, maybe you start to bump heads a little bit. But these are guys that every institution has let down, frankly, whether it's their families, whether it's the schools, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's churches, social service agencies, nobody has met them where they are. And the only institution that hasn't met them where they are is the guy in the corner. That's it. They've been there and all of us have been absent. And until we start, we got to compete with them, and we can win that, but we got to compete. We got to be in the game. We got to be there every day. We got to be relentless.
And just to add to that, we asked guys on the corner why and how they're so successful. And they said, listen, when you go to school, when Johnny go to school, I see Johnny. When Johnny come home, I see Johnny. When you send Johnny to the grocery store to go and get an item from the grocery store, whether it be milk or bread or whatever, I see Johnny. Your problem is that when you come out here for an hour. And then you go back home. Our problem is that we're not consistent in being as consistent as the individuals that are on the street corners recruiting our kids. They're there and they're determined to do what they need to do to make their business successful. We have to take the same attitude. Our problem is that our city, our state, our country do not put money behind street-level intervention services. We cannot put us in the same category as an after-school program. There's two different worlds.
That's a good point. We need to out-recruit some of the recruiters on the street.
And again, just to push that, we need to do both. We need to do the after-school. We should not be competing.
Yes,
we need to do early childhood. We've got to start at baby. So I don't want to pit these two against each other. And the more we can do in the prevention, the better off we're going to be. So I'm all for that. But you can't do that and then neglect this population who has not been served well all their lives and solve this problem. And again, the fact that we spend so much after the fact to incarcerate, to lock up, which I would argue exacerbates the problem, and not to give opportunities on the front end. This is not a lack of resources. This is a policy choice where we're spending huge amounts of dollars at the back end and not smaller dollars at the front end.
Yeah, and we're all sitting here, very well-dressed men, and one of the things that always frustrates me about these conversations is exactly it's conversation. And back to what you were saying earlier, Autry, you talked about the disparities in the city, and I remember watching after the Cubs won, and people up there celebrating and stuff like that, and this was after I'd done the gang story. And I was just thinking back, I wonder what my guys down in Woodlawn are doing right now. They probably, it's a completely different world. And do you think that disparity, what do you all think that disparity in world outlook, how does that impact our ability to solve the solution? In other words, if we can somehow get folks who are not part of this world, who don't live down there, to connect with it better, how could that help? Do any of you thoughts?
I'll start. I don't have no problem starting. We do these things called lived experiences. I had an opportunity the other day to speak with a world-renowned chef. And she was telling me about how her friends donate to causes. And I was thinking, I just went on wings of imagination. Just imagine if street-level intervention, guys on the corner, got to actually sit down with those individuals who write checks and actually get them to understand that this is not a feel-good situation. We're not here for you to feel good about writing a check to us so that the little people on the south side and west side can feel better and actually do something. It's about you caring about what's happening to your neighbor, which is us, which is the people who live in Inglewood, the people who live in Auburn Gresham, the people who live in East Garfield Park. We're the neighbors, we're your brothers and sisters of the people who live in Lincoln Park. We're the same people that look, our blood is just as red as the people in Winnetka. We're just saying that if we had the opportunity, I would love to just sit down with individuals who have the ability to write checks that won't even hurt them, to not just do it for a feel-good situation, but understand why you're writing it.
Yeah. Anuj, I'm curious, what does the research say about giving young men and women who are in these, situations, these high intensity situations, giving them access to, other parts of the community or other resources? What does the research say about how that could help, in terms of gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think to any extent that you can break down those barriers, and it's quite helpful. So Jens has done some work where he's evaluated and looked at what are the benefits of like a moving to opportunity program, where you take people from poor neighborhoods and you give them vouchers where they can live in wealthier neighborhoods. And you see that one thing that at least does is it reduces stress, and it might even improve long-term well-being as well. And so that's an extreme version of breaking down those barriers or giving other opportunities, but you see that it does have positive effects.
Gotcha. And we've talked a lot about opportunity and giving that opportunity, but Arnie, I want to ask you one question here. Sometimes when you engage with young people, and what I've found is that a lot of them, there's these kind of long-running beefs that they're kind of wrapped up in. And there's a need to somehow get them past it, to say, hey, that was old, that's just, let's leave that in the past. Is it as simple as like, hey, I'll give you a job and those old beefs die? Like, how do you
No, it's
that?
much harder than that. Yeah. And I mean, again, we deal with this weekly. I mean, we were dealing with this a couple days ago. And no, the retaliation ethic or that's real. That's real. And so this is not you just snap a finger and give a job or do a counseling session and this stuff goes away. It's walking with them. It's talking it through. It's trying to help them, again, not tell them what to do, but help them think through what does this mean for the rest of their life and what do they want to do. And all of the guys we're working with, every single one of them has lost family members, have lost guys in their clique. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 funerals in 9, 10 months. I mean, it's an insane loss of life. And the question is, what's the natural, logical conclusion of that? And the conclusion is it never ends if you keep going that way. So it's just how do you honor your loved one who was lost? And are there other ways to honor their memory than by going and shooting somebody? But this is a very real tension that we work on every single day.
Archie, how do you address that tension?
Yeah. I think revenge is a very powerful drug because we deal with individuals on a daily basis who are dealing with the death of their friends, the death of their brother. The reason why they join the gangs, in my opinion, is that they feel a loss of something that they don't have at home. So they join a gang so they can feel like they have a family.
Yeah.
And what happens is that when that family member gets hurt or get killed, revenge sets in because you've killed someone that was close to me. So we have to deal with the fact that we're dealing with individuals who have a mindset of, I have to make sure that no one else ever think about shooting another one of my family members. Mm-hmm. So we go out and we do everything we can to prove to the people who shot him that you'll never want to do it again. So our job, I'm sorry, Ernie, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Our job is to make sure that our people that are working the street get those individuals. And our key to this whole thing is time. We have to be there when that moment in time comes where that person is ready to turn his life around. We have to be there to help that person do it.
And I don't want to get, this is hard and real, but I just want to let you know what's possible, just being very real here. So one of the guys, and we have some of our Chicago Cred family here tonight, and they're amazing young men. One of our guys, his guy was killed about a month ago. The guy who was killed when our guy was shot a couple years ago, he went and did the retaliation. So now it's not just one of your guys killed, it's the guy who retaliated when you were shot and went and did it. Well, he didn't go retaliate. He didn't go retaliate.
Yeah. Well, we're running out on time here. We want to get to some questions. But before we do that, just each of you real quick. Again, I hate just talking. So I'm sure these people, they're here because they don't just want to talk either. So give the people here, the people watching on Facebook Live, what are things that each of these people can be doing to make a difference? Anush, can we start with you?
So I think a lot of times we start by, when we're far away from the violence, we say, okay, here's the broad social things that have to change, and we need to take action on those fronts. But along the lines of what Autry's saying, a lot of times it's about, okay, what are the organizations that are trying to take the hand that we're dealt with right now and do bit by bit? And those little bits start to add up, so that's often a good place to allocate effort or time or money also.
Autry?
Yeah, I would reach out specifically to the uncles of the individuals that's on the corner carrying a gun every morning. I would challenge the uncles to do what we do on a normal basis. Talk to him, talk to her. You have more influence than you think. Our kids don't want to be out there, and they just want the opportunity for someone to say, don't do it. Someone that they trust, someone that they love. Use your influence to help change a community.
Just quickly, I'll give you the context for my answer, and I'll get there quick. Is the context is collectively, I believe strongly that we are failing. We are absolutely failing. None of us are winning. Right. Guys on the street aren't winning. We're not winning. Police are winning. We are failing right now. So that's, we got a lot of people working hard. We're all working hard, but we are not, none of us are doing enough. None of us. So if we're going to change that, two things. If we want to stop failing, one is we have to make ourselves uncomfortable. We have to do some things that stretch us and move us into situations and move us into communities and move us into relationships that are outside our comfort zone. And we all have to do that. The second thing I think is a mindset shift, that we can't see our young men as part of the problem. We can't just see them as part of the solution. We have to see them as the solution. They are actually going to lead our communities where we need to go. And we need to support them, we need to nurture them, we need to challenge them, we need to walk with them, we need to love them. But none of us here are going to solve this. It's going to be our young men who are going to solve this.
Good. With that, do we have any questions?
Yes, we've got lots of questions.
Okay, great.
The first one from Kevin Magnan here in the audience, and it builds off a point that Arnie just made. The question is, the recent Metropolitan Planning Council's report showed just how segregated Chicago is as a city. What social services should we employ to help integrate Chicago communities?
How do we integrate? That's a... Anush, research-wise, you got something? Come on, you're the smart one up here. Come on.
I appreciate being called the smart one. I also would have to admit that I don't know, and I think there's more expertise on the stage that might be able to speak to it. So.
I'm going to go repeat the question.
What can we do to help integrate the city, basically?
Yeah.
It's like, how can we integrate the city?
How we can integrate.
Yes. Integrate.
Well, again, in my humble opinion, is that we communicate. I think we think too big and we think too hard. Something as small as communicating. Like, for instance, when you're in the grocery store and you see a black man walking past you, you don't have to really grab your purse. Truth. Communication is real important to a lot of the things that are happening in our city. We're not talking to each other. That's honestly my opinion. We're not talking to each other. We have to, the individuals that's on the corners, when you pass them, say hello.
That's good. You got anything to add? Or no?
Say hello. I like that.
There you go. Staying away from that one. That's a good one.
And we've got a number of questions that speak to a theme that often came up on the panel about how do we measure the effectiveness of organizations. And I feel like you've addressed that pretty clearly. But Autry, if I may, I have a specific question for you. You said the best way to tell if an organization is effective is to talk to the leader. Yes?
I didn't say talk, I said look.
Look at the leader.
Look at the leader.
Okay. So I'm going to make you in charge of distributing money to all the community organizations. If you were to go and sit down and interview the leaders of these organizations, to make the decision about who's going to get the money, what would that interview look like? What would be the key questions for you?
My first opportunity would be to hire you. Okay. Some of the things you look for in an organization is, one thing that we learned is that street don't lie. And what that means is this: if the people on the street know that your organization is real, it will tell itself. I'll give you an example. A few months ago, maybe 9 months ago, our front door, which is all glass, a car went straight through it. And literally, it's 4:30 in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and we get to work, nothing is stolen. Our computers are still on the ground, on the table. Our pens are exactly where they are. Anybody in our community had the opportunity to walk into our office and actually take whatever they wanted. When we got to work and when I got the phone call from the police that something had happened, when we got to work, everything was still in its place. Why? Because we built relationships in the community for real. And how do you do that? You do that by actually walking the street and communicating with people who don't look like you, who wear their pants down, who wear drays with a white shirt. You introduce yourself to them so that they will understand that you're there to help them. I hope I'm answering your question. Yeah. So one of the things that I would look for is street credibility.
Mm-hmm. Authenticity, essentially.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And this question from Rosemary Carrick, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. How do you train youth for jobs when many don't have basic literacy or work skills? How do you convince employers to hire them?
I'll look at Ernie. You can take this one, education.
Former Secretary of Education, please.
So, well, I'll go back to my mother 50 years ago, is you start where people are. And you start where they are and you work with them. And everybody can learn. Some of our guys are brilliant. They don't have the best formal education. Some of them left school at 12, 13, 14, but they're a lot smarter than any of us up here. So you start where they are, you work with them, and you practice this stuff. And again, you have good days, you have bad days, you work on punctuality, you work on shaking hands, you work on conflict resolution, just as we do in any of the rest of our jobs. But you start where you are and you hold yourselves accountable each week, and you get a little bit better, a little bit better. And again, it's not overnight success, but 3 months from now, you should be in a different place if you're both working at it than you are today. And that's how you get there. You chip away, chip away, chip away.
And just to add, when you talk about smarts, how many of y'all have ever gone to one of these neighborhoods and tried to shoot dice with these guys? I could not understand that at all. They're all like, and I mean, these are very intelligent young men.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank our panel. Thank you all for joining us.
I need a hand up for real. Good job.
And I do want to say thank you for all your questions. There were so many smart ones. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to get to all of them. Now I want to bring out my colleague Mark Lacey again and Dr. Selwyn Rogers for our last session. Thank you.
Good to be back. Dr. Rogers, let's jump right in. Violence, urban violence, can feel like an abstract issue. It's this public policy issue, law enforcement issue. A trauma surgeon has a completely different view. It is something, tell us what it looks like when it gets to you in the trauma center, in the emergency room. What does this look like?
Oftentimes when a victim of intentional violence comes to the emergency department, we have a few minutes, perhaps 5, 10, where we get a notification from Emergency Medicine Services, the Chicago Fire Department. And then shortly after, they give us a very brief synopsis, approximate age, the mechanism of injury, gunshot wound, stabbing, assault. We then activate a team of coordinated professionals, nurses, trauma surgeons, first responders in the emergency department that go through somewhat of a choreographed set of dances. We call that the trauma response. And that trauma response largely focuses on identifying what the injuries are, and then going from identifying the injuries, prioritizing what's first, second, and third is likely to kill someone. The challenge is in that situation, what you're trying to do is take something that's very chaotic, a gunshot wound, an assault, a stabbing, and create order through it, for it, in order to save someone's life. The challenge is even when you do all of those actions, you still lose people. There's still an incredible loss. And as you are going through the choreographed, well-trained set of steps, the thing that often comes back is the sense of loss. Because then you have to share that sense of loss with the loved one. And I actually have always tried to be the stalwart, if you will, because in the middle of a trauma resuscitation, you need to be very structured, very sound, very disciplined. The challenge is, in that moment, you ignore all of the emotions because the emotions take away your ability to actually function effectively because someone you know could die. But then subsequent to that, when the resuscitation is complete and the outcome is being determined about what the next step is, the next step being the operating room, the intensive care unit for ongoing resuscitation, transfusion of blood, or a trip to the intensive interventional radiology suite. The challenge that we then have is how do you then communicate that to the family? And then you have to actually have this toggle switch. You've got to become human again.
All of a sudden, emotion has to be a big part.
You have to be able to regain your empathy. You regain the ability to connect with another. And it often reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite poets, poet laureate, rest in peace, Maya Angelou. People don't often remember what you say or what you do. They remember how you make them feel. And every time when you have to have one of those conversations, if you can't feel, you can't touch lives.
So you are the closer at this conference. You're the last person we're going to hear from. And that's really the role a hospital often plays in street violence. You're dealing with this problem at the end when there's someone in distress trying to keep them alive. Is that the role a hospital should play at the end?
I think a hospital has a multiplicity of roles, at least a modern hospital should. We are often the portal of entry for trauma victims, but we need to start breaking down the walls of the hospital and actually reach out to the community and be part of a multiplicity of partners to tackle this issue of prevention. As Arnie Duncan was mentioning, Kim Fox as well, one of the things that has happened is we often treat the victims, those with proven risk, because violence is, in my opinion, a disease of our society, a disease of communities, because it disproportionately affects some, mostly black and brown people in this country, who also are linked with poverty, disinvestment, unemployment, and lack of educational opportunities. And it's the nexus of all those things that eventuates in the outcome of violence. If you dial that back, how can we actually take individuals' proven risk, be they the shooter or the victim, because either way, they've been harmed. But they've been harmed in the context of the environment in which they've lived. And there's actually no innocent person in that context because of the structural violence that has led some people to be more at risk for being the victims of violence than others. Hospitals have a unique role both as research engines, as conveners, as advocates, and also as accompaniment to patients who have suffered violence, to wrap them around with a set of services, especially, for example, mental health services, to address what can often be sequelae of the physical violence. Because focusing just on the physical repair of a broken blood vessel or a damaged bowel only repairs the physical part of the body. It doesn't address the psychological, the emotional. And it's that part of the person that may be broken the most that we have to think about how can we restore that person to health and to wellness.
So you're a newcomer to Chicago. You just arrived in January, you were telling me, and you are here to create a trauma center, a level 1 trauma center on the south side at the University of Chicago.
Yes,
now, this is an issue that the people in this room have heard about for decades. It's been a big issue here. The lack of a trauma center in the center of the community that really needs it. Have you picked up the frustration that exists on the south side, other parts of town, on this issue in your time here?
One of the things that I did upon arrival, being ignorant to the city of Chicago, is I listened. I listened attentively. I reached out to the community, churches, community centers, community grand rounds to really try to learn the community, and I'm still learning it in many ways. And I understand that Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, many, many neighborhoods. And one neighborhood is different from another. But some of the challenges are very similar. And one of the central features when I've engaged with the community is this issue of safety, of not feeling safe, of folks saying, I don't feel safe letting my kid go outside and play on the street. I don't want them to get hurt. Or I don't feel safe letting my son go down the street to play a game of basketball. Mm-hmm. And that sense of lack of safety reinforces something that I've always thought. You can't possibly be healthy if you're not safe. Mm-hmm. From Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts with physiology. Mm-hmm. But once you get past physiology, the next level is safety. How can you get to self-actualization, being your best self, whatever that best self is, if you don't feel safe?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, it's no secret that this violence is disproportionately affecting young Black and Latino males. When you look at, and this is not just a fact in Chicago, it's all in cities across America. I mean, when you are in a trauma center, when you're looking at one of the gunshot victims, what's going through your head? How are you connecting with that person?
Well, I've had maybe a blessing and a curse of having served as a trauma surgeon in Boston, Philadelphia, and now in Chicago. And it's often saddens me that the victims that I am standing over look like me, or look like one of my 3 sons, who are 21, 18, and 14. And I often think, could this next person be my son? And that actually propels me to action. It doesn't paralyze me, but it makes me really concerned about the set of structural factors that put some people, who are mostly people of color, at risk to be in situations where they're more likely to be injured by gun violence or by any form of intentional violence.
Mm-hmm. I years ago worked at the LA Times, and I covered gangs in Los Angeles, and I remember I would talk to gang members, and I would realize that they're just young people, and I sort of always thought that if I had grown up in that neighborhood, I would be hanging out with these guys. You have a Harvard degree. You are wearing a very fancy bow tie, beautiful bow tie. Do you believe that you truly connect with someone growing up poor on the south side of Chicago who doesn't have opportunity?
So I grew up poor in another part of the United States of America. I also have to remind people that the United States Virgin Islands is part of the United States, but that's a separate conversation. But growing up poor on a small island, I grew up in St. Croix, there was not a lot of opportunities, right? The opportunities were largely driven by 2. There was a Hess oil refinery, which refined oil from Venezuela. for the Hess Oil Company, and there was tourism. And then the third industry was the government. I'm not special. I just had a lot of people around me who invested in me as a person. Those people, be it mom, be it grandma, be it dad, be it extended family, be it teachers, I just grew up saying, okay, I happen to be smart in school, whatever you want to say smart as, and I got reinforced for being smart. I got praised for being smart. When I was bored in 5th grade, I didn't get told I had attention deficit. I actually got told, maybe we're not challenging you enough, and I skipped ahead a grade. That constant challenge, when I was a sophomore in high school, my teacher, Mrs. Olive Walcott, shout out to Mrs. Olive Walcott, she said, hey, you're quick at math, but really, can you actually teach anything? Why don't you teach this class? Let me challenge you. Being challenged made me think anything was possible. We are wasting a generation of young people by not challenging them about where their talents are. And that's what I would like to do in the context of hearing all that's happened so far, because we are at a crossroads in Chicago. But we need to fundamentally change the narrative. If we don't change the narrative about making the most of the opportunity of life for our young people, we're losing generations that will never come back. Changing the narrative that it's not bad people doing bad things to bad people, but instead a set of circumstances, the impact of structural violence, racism, discrimination, lack of opportunities, that's disinvesting in our most precious commodity, our people.
So you have 3 sons. What do you tell them about the violence, about police, about what sort of lessons do you have for your young sons as they're growing up?
So 2 of my 3 sons drive. 21-year-old and 18-year-old. The 21-year-old has always been the laid-back driver, right? Music on, blasting. And the lesson is the same lesson that the 18-year-old heard. If you're speeding and you get stopped, both hands on the wheels. It's just a lesson you have to teach your sons because of what I'll call implicit bias. Just because you're driving your dad's BMW doesn't mean that you stole it. Okay? But moreover, my kids' lived experience, being middle-class kids, is very different than the kids in the South Side. I'm probably more like the kids in the South Side with my upbringing than many kids in the South Side because of their lived experiences. Their lived experiences, they always had a dad who was a surgeon. I wasn't that special, it was just dad. Goofed off on me, I'm the stupidest guy in the world. By the way, I think all dads are the stupidest guys in the world. But with respect to the reality of what was possible, they saw what was possible. And when a kid is in Englewood or Bronzeville, and they've actually never been to Lake Michigan, or they have never seen Mag Mile, what's possible for that kid?
What you were telling me about how surprised you were by the proximity of prosperity to poverty in this city. You know, you're coming here with fresh eyes. Tell me a little bit about that. 8 miles you were talking about.
So 85 years of age is the average life expectancy of a resident in the Loop. 69 years of age is the life expectancy a quarter mile from near Chicago in Washington Park. 8 miles, 7 stops from the L separates those 2 geographies. What drives that? It's profound. I'm, with my fiance, prepared to train for a marathon. That's kind of one of the things we do together. We run together. 8 miles is like an hour and a half run. 8 miles separates 16 years in a great city like Chicago. we have opportunities to do much better.
So a trauma center, you're creating this trauma center that's going to be a busy place. You have, the numbers we're hearing about, they're coming to your doors. What do you think you can do to make the trauma center, basically have everybody be bored on a Saturday night? Just basically put the trauma center out of business, not have it.
It's a great problem, and in fact, it's a vision that I have, and it's going to be a journey to get there. First and foremost, we have to provide high quality, high touch trauma care for every patient that walks in the door. Mm-hmm. But secondly, for those of proven risk by either the circumstances or their environment, we have to think creatively about treating the violence that impacted them as a disease. There are risk factors, there are interventions, there is the impact of not post-traumatic stress disorder, present traumatic stress disorder, toxic stress, where some people are living with risk of home insecurity, that's otherwise called homelessness, food insecurity, that's otherwise called hunger, the inability to know if am I safe today. That degree of burden leads people to make a whole set of rational choices given their circumstance. How can Trauma Center, partnering with many other partners, we heard a lot of, from the legal perspective with Kim Fox and the superintendent of police in Inglewood, District 7, to a number of people from the crime lab, to partners in the community. How can we create a set of intersectional activities that wrap around services for the victims of violence and their families? Because violence does not, the 764 homicides from last year and the 150 so far, it's not isolated to those individuals. It's a ripple effect on their families, on their children, on their friends, on their communities. And that dramatically alters people's sense of wellness. Mm-hmm. And without feeling safe, none of us can really be well.
One thing you definitely notice when you're talking to people on the South Side is a sense of hopelessness. There's a lot of people who don't believe it is going to change. They can't really imagine their neighborhood being any different than the way it is. I mean, you are sounding hopeful here. Are you hopeful?
I'm incredibly hopeful, not just because I'm an optimist or not because I'm a person of deep faith. I just believe in the goodness of people. And I think if we can actually actively change the narrative, change the way we're approaching the problem, be more holistic around how we engage with, be intimate with, be proximate to those who've been victims of violence and their loved ones, we could change the outcome of their lives and bend the moral arc that they're on and accompany them not for a minute, not for an hour, but for a lifetime. And that's the investment that we're going to take and that we all need to take to make a difference in the lives of young people.
You mentioned moral arc. You told me before if you had not become a surgeon, what was the other career that you think was possible?
One of the great things about being a surgeon is you get to fix things, right? There's, operations have beginnings, they have middle, and they have and you know what the outcome is going to be. One of the things that I've been inspired by as I've gone on my journey of actually the fact that I actually really like people is realizing that just fixing someone physically doesn't really complete the job. And the other thing I would have done had I not done what I do with my hands, heart, and mind is focusing on my mind and my heart, and I probably would have gone into the priesthood.
Wow. So if you, imagine you're in charge of Chicago. I'm not going to give you a title, but you get to do, just sort of run the place for a day. I mean, what is the single thing you would do that you would change to make considerable headway? What's the one thing?
I think the one thing I would do as someone who has been around many parts of the city is I would force the issue of people being in proximity to each other who currently often don't even see each other. And getting close to someone else who is different than you provides an incredible opportunity to see what you currently may not see. And it's really only through that degree of connectedness of each other as not the other, but as us, that we actually have a chance to work together to solve this problem.
So connection would be the one thing. Yeah.
Never doubt that committed people working together can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead, I love that quote.
Great. Well, Doctor, thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank you all. I want to thank you all for coming. This has we've heard a whole lot. There's a whole lot to chew on. We're going to continue the conversation at a reception just outside. On behalf of the New York Times, the University of Chicago Crime Lab, all of the sponsors, we thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.